Her father gave her to a giant Apache because she was obese. That's what the town said, loud enough for heaven to hear. They laughed at her shame, certain no man could ever love a girl like that. But out past the ridge, where the forge burns and the wind carries no judgment, something unexpected took root. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't kind. He was something else entirely. And when the law came knocking, and the dust refused to settle, everything they thought they knew began to crack. She was given away like a burden. But what if she was the only one brave enough to stay? Every story begins with a heartbeat. Tell me, where are you in the world today, and how are you really doing? Your words make this space feel more human. The wagon's wooden wheels creaked beneath them as they followed the dusty trail out of 3 wells. Clara sat rigid on the bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, fighting back tears that threatened to spill. The setting sun painted the hills in shades of amber and purple, but she barely noticed the beauty through her fog of hurt and confusion. Tocho handled the reins with steady hands, his broad shoulders straight and his face unreadable. He hadn't spoken a word since that simple "come" at the hitching post, and the silence between them felt as vast as the open prairie stretching out before them. The gentle clip-clop of the horse's hooves kicked up little puffs of dust that settled on Clara's skirts. She brushed at them absently, her mind replaying the awful moment when her father had practically pushed her toward Tocho like she was just another sack of grain to be bartered away. The memory made her chest tighten. A cool breeze stirred, carrying the scent of sage and bringing goosebumps to her arms. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to make herself smaller, a habit she'd developed over years of enduring pointed stares and cruel whispers about her size. The wagon hit a rut, jostling them both. Clara grabbed the seat's edge to steady herself, and Tocho's arm shot out instinctively to keep her from falling. His touch was light, barely there, and he withdrew it immediately once she was stable. "Thank you," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the wagon's creaking. Tocho gave a slight nod, his eyes still fixed on the trail ahead. But something in his posture seemed to soften, just a fraction. They passed the old Peterson place, its abandoned buildings standing like gray ghosts in the fading light. Clara had always wondered about the family that once lived there, what dreams they'd carried west with them, what hardships had driven them away. Now she felt a kinship with those long-gone strangers, uprooted, uncertain, at the mercy of others' decisions. The wagon rounded a bend, and Clara caught sight of smoke rising from a chimney in the distance. Her heart began to race. Was that where they were headed? What kind of life awaited her there? She stole a glance at the man beside her, studying his profile in the dying light. Tocho's features were strong, his skin weathered by sun and wind. A few strands of his dark hair had come loose from their tie, moving gently in the breeze. Despite his imposing size, there was something careful in the way he handled the reins, something almost gentle in how he guided the horses around the deeper ruts in the trail. The sound of running water grew stronger, and Clara realized they were approaching 3 Wells Creek. The water caught the last rays of sunlight, sparkling like scattered coins. A meadowlark's evening song floated across the grass, sweet and clear. Tocho drew the horses to a stop near the creek bank. Clara's hands tightened in her lap, uncertain what to expect. But he simply reached beneath the seat and pulled out a canteen, offering it to her first. "Water!" His voice was deep but quiet, like distant thunder. Clara accepted the canteen with trembling fingers, suddenly aware of how dry her throat had become. "Thank you," she managed again, taking a careful sip of the cool water. When she tried to hand it back, Tocho shook his head. "Keep it close. Journey's not done." They were the most words he'd spoken since leaving town, and something in their simple kindness made Clara's eyes burn with fresh tears. She blinked them back, determined not to cry in front of this stranger who was now, by her father's decree, supposed to be her husband. The horses drank from the creek, their splashing a peaceful sound in the gathering dusk. A lone coyote called from somewhere in the hills, and another answered. Clara watched as Tocho pulled something from his pocket, a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He opened it carefully, revealing what looked like dried meat and corn cakes, Breaking the food in half, he offered the larger portion to Clara without comment. The simple gesture, sharing his meal, making sure she had water, spoke of consideration she hadn't expected. It didn't erase the shame of how she'd come to be here, but it eased something tight in her chest, just a little. As they ate in silence, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Clara remembered her mother teaching her the constellations when she was small, before the fever took her. She wondered what Mama would think of this day, of what Papa had done. The thought brought a fresh wave of pain, but Clara pushed it down, focusing instead on the taste of the corn cake, the sound of the creek, the peaceful breathing of the horses. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she would face it with the same quiet strength that had carried her through years of sideways glances and whispered judgments. She was more than what others saw when they looked at her, more than a burden to be traded away. The wagon wound through stands of juniper and red stone formations that glowed like embers in the last light. Clara held tight to the seat as they climbed higher into rugged country she'd never seen before. Just when she thought they couldn't go further, the trail opened onto a small mesa clearing. Clara's breath caught at the unexpected sight. Instead of the crude camp she'd imagined, a well-built cabin stood proudly against the darkening sky. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, and neat rows of apple trees stretched behind it, their branches heavy with ripening fruit. To one side sat a blacksmith's forge with its familiar bellows and anvil. The whole homestead spoke of care and patient work. Tocho brought the wagon to a stop and helped Clara down without touching more than her hand. His calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle. Up close, she could see the cabin was larger than it first appeared. 2 rooms, with fresh-cut logs still golden where they'd been recently added. He led her to the door, pushing it open to reveal a tidy interior lit by oil lamps. A stone hearth dominated one wall, with cooking pots hanging nearby. Simple furniture, a table, chairs, shelves, stocked with provisions, filled the main room. But what caught Clara's attention was the smaller room off to the side. Tocho gestured toward it. "Your room," he said quietly. "Made it ready." Clara stepped inside, stunned to find a narrow but comfortable space. A proper bed with clean linens, a small window with actual glass, even a hook for her shawl. The floor had been freshly swept, and a bunch of wild sunflowers sat in a tin cup on the windowsill. She turned back to find Tocho hanging a kettle over the fire. The domestic normalcy of the gesture, so at odds with how she'd come to be here, made her throat tight. Soon the kettle whistled, and he poured hot water over dried herbs in 2 cups, offering one to Clara without a word. The tea's familiar scent, mint and something sweeter, brought the day's emotions rushing back. Clara retreated to her room, the cup trembling in her hands. As darkness fell outside, she huddled in the corner and let the tears flow freely at last. Through her quiet sobs, she could hear Tocho moving about the main room, preparing a simple supper. He never intruded, never commented on her crying. Just sat silently by the hearth, the firelight throwing his shadow long across the floor. Clara must have fallen asleep eventually because she woke to pale dawn light and an unexpected smell, bread baking. She lay still for a moment, disoriented, until memory rushed back. This wasn't her narrow bed at the ranch. This was her new home? The thought was still too strange to grasp. Unsure what was expected of her, Clara smoothed her wrinkled dress and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and wood smoke. She found Tocho at his forge, already at work. The steady rhythm of his hammer on hot iron rang across the clearing, and sparks flew like early stars. Later, wanting to show some gratitude for his unexpected kindness, Clara attempted to cook dinner. But her mind wandered, and the beans burned black in the pot. She was scraping desperately at the mess when Tocho came in from the forge. Shame burned her cheeks as she set the scorched food before him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'll do better tomorrow." But Tocho simply picked up his spoon and began eating without complaint. Clara watched in disbelief as he finished every bite. Finally, gathering her courage, she asked the question that had haunted her since yesterday. "Why did you agree?" To take me?" Tocho set down his spoon and met her eyes for the first time since 3 wells. His gaze was steady, unflinching. "You were not wanted," he said simply. "But that does not mean you are nothing." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, both the harsh truth of her father's rejection and the dignity Tocho offered in its place. She looked down at her own untouched plate, vision blurring with tears again. But these were different tears than before. Clara settled into a rhythm at Tocho's homestead as autumn deepened. Each morning she woke to the distant ring of his hammer at the forge, a sound that had become oddly comforting. The apple trees needed tending, their branches heavy with red gold fruit ready for picking. She found peace in the simple work, filling baskets while clouds cast shadows across the mesa. The wooden porch collected dust and leaves, giving her another daily task. As she swept, she would pause to watch Tocho work. His movements at the forge were precise and purposeful, each strike of the hammer transforming raw metal into something useful. The sight stirred something in her, a curiosity she couldn't ignore. One afternoon, after gathering her courage, Clara approached the forge. Could I help?" she asked, half expecting him to turn her away. Tocho looked up from the piece he was working, studying her face. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "Come," he said, gesturing her closer. "Stand here." He positioned her carefully, showing her how to hold the heavy tongs. His hands were gentle as he adjusted her grip, his voice soft as he explained where to stand to avoid the sparks. "Like this?" Clara asked, gripping the tongs more firmly. "Yes." The approval in his voice made her stand straighter. "Strong hands. Good." They worked together as the sun moved across the sky, Clara learning to anticipate when Tocho needed the metal turned or cooled. Few words passed between them, but the silence felt comfortable, filled with the rhythm of work and the crackle of the forge. That evening, as they sat at the table sharing a simple meal of cornbread and stew, Clara found herself speaking thoughts she'd kept buried. "Back in town," she said, staring into her bowl, "I always thought I'd be laughed at forever. The big girl, the unwanted one." Tocho set down his spoon, his dark eyes serious. "Among my people," he said quietly, "strength is not mocked. A strong woman is like the earth itself. She carries life, holds us all up." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. But for once they weren't tears of shame. She blinked them back and took another bite of stew, letting his words sink deep into her heart. A week later, their supplies running low, Clara decided to make the trip into 3 wells alone. She hitched up the wagon just as Tocho had shown her, proud when the horses responded to her confident hands. The familiar sight of the mercantile's weathered sign brought back memories of that awful day. But Clara squared her shoulders and pushed through the door. The bell's cheerful jingle seemed at odds with Mr. McNabb's sour expression when he saw her. "We don't serve," he began, but Clara cut him off. "I need needles and sugar," she said firmly. "Tocho sent me to settle his account." The change in McNabb's demeanor was immediate. "Ah, yes, well, Tocho's credit is good here," he said, suddenly businesslike. "What size needles did you need?" As Clara gathered her purchases, movement outside the window caught her eye. Dr. Callahan stood on the boardwalk with Sheriff Monroe, their heads close together in conversation. The doctor's face was animated, his hands gesturing emphatically while the sheriff nodded. When Callahan pointed in the direction of Tocho's land, Clara's stomach clenched with worry. She hurried to finish her transaction, trying to appear calm as she loaded the supplies into the wagon. The whole way home, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling their whispered conversation had given her. That evening, as Tocho worked at the hearth repairing a pot, Clara told him what she'd seen. "Doctor," Callahan was talking to the sheriff, she said, twisting her apron in her hands. "They were pointing toward your land. I don't like the way they looked." Tocho continued his work, his hands steady as he smoothed a patch of metal. "They will come," he said simply, as if he'd been expecting this all along. Then he looked up, meeting her worried gaze. "But we do not run." Something in his quiet certainty helped Clara breathe easier. She nodded and went back to preparing their supper, moving with new purpose around the cabin that had somehow become home. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The autumn wind rustled through the apple trees as Clara worked, her basket nearly full of ripe fruit. The steady rhythm of picking had become almost meditative over the past days. She'd just reached for another apple when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pause. Dr. Callahan rode into view on his gleaming bay horse, his black medical bag secured behind the saddle. Clara's stomach tightened as he dismounted with practiced grace, brushing dust from his fine wool coat. "Miss Wheaton," he called out, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I trust I find you well?" Clara set down her basket slowly. "Dr. Callahan. What brings you out this way?" "Concern, my dear. Pure concern." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Several prominent citizens have expressed worry about your situation here." Before Clara could respond, Tocho emerged from his forge, wiping his hands on his leather apron. He said nothing, but his presence seemed to fill the space between them. Callahan's pleasant facade slipped for just a moment. "Ah, and here's the man himself." He turned back to Clara, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "My dear, you must see how this arrangement is corrupting the very fabric of our community. A respectable young woman living with—" He paused, glancing at Tocho with barely concealed disdain. "Well, it simply won't do." "I'm fine here," Clara said firmly, though her hands trembled slightly. "There's no need for concern." "But you're clearly unwell," Callahan pressed. "Anyone can see you're sickly with shame. Your reputation is ruined. Come now, return home before it's too late. Your father—" "My father traded me like a sack of grain," Clara cut in, her voice stronger now. "And you never showed concern for my well-being before, Doctor." "Callahan." The doctor's mask of civility cracked entirely. "You ungrateful girl. Do you think anyone else would have you? Living here with a savage, you've made yourself even more worthless than you already were." Tocho took a step forward, but Clara raised her hand slightly, stopping him. "Leave our land, Dr. Callahan. You're not welcome here." "Your land?" Callahan laughed coldly as he mounted his horse. "We'll see about that." He gathered his reins, looking down at them both. "Mark my words, girl. You'll regret choosing this path. Some things can't be undone." They watched him ride away, dust settling in his wake. Clara stood rigid until he disappeared from view, then her shoulders began to shake. She managed to hold herself together through the afternoon, mechanically finishing her chores, but as evening fell, something inside her crumbled. Sitting at the rough-hewn table, Clara finally let the tears come. "Maybe he's right," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Maybe I am ruined now. Who would ever—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Tocho sat quietly across from her, his presence steady as always. He listened as words poured out of her. Years of shame, of feeling unwanted, of trying to make herself smaller despite her size. When her tears finally slowed, he rose and went to a shelf near the hearth. He returned with a small leather pouch, weathered and decorated with careful beadwork. Opening it, he removed a bundle of dried sage, its sharp, clean scent filling the air between them. Without speaking, he touched the herbs to her forehead in a gentle blessing, his dark eyes full of understanding and something deeper, respect. Clara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his silent prayer settle over her like a warm blanket. In that moment, she felt truly seen, truly honored, perhaps for the first time in her life. The next morning, Clara rose early, determined to face the day despite her raw emotions. She walked out to the orchard, breathing in the crisp dawn air. There, beneath her favorite apple tree, stood something new, a bench carved from rich mesquite wood. She approached it slowly, running her hand along the smooth surface. It was wide and sturdy, built to hold her comfortably without fear or shame. Into the side, Tocho had carved an intricate pattern of wind and fruit, the lines flowing like a dance. Below the design was a single word in Apache: Shie, beloved. Clara sank onto the bench, feeling its strength support her completely. Tears came again, but these were different. Tears of recognition, of being known, of finding somewhere she truly belonged. She traced the carved letters with trembling fingers, understanding that this was more than just a place to sit. It was a declaration, a promise, a gift that said what Tocho's quiet ways could not. The morning sun caught the polished wood, warming it beneath her touch, and Clara wept freely, letting the bench hold all of her size, her strength, her worth, exactly as she was. The days grew shorter as autumn settled deeper into the hills around Three Wells. Morning frost decorated the apple trees, and wood smoke curled from the cabin's chimney more often now. Clara found herself falling into an easy rhythm with Tocho, their days filled with the quiet work of preparing for winter. In the kitchen, Clara lined up glass jars while Tocho brought in the last of the apples. She'd learned to read his silences now, the thoughtful pause when he approved of something, the slight tilt of his head when he was considering a problem. They worked together, preserving fruit, their movements becoming synchronized without need for words. During breaks from the forge, Tocho showed her which plants could heal and which could harm. He pointed out yerba mansa growing near the spring, explaining how his people used it for wounds. When Clara expressed interest, he began sharing more, stories of coyote and crow, tales of how the stars found their places in the sky. One chilly morning, Clara went out early to bring in firewood. The stack was getting low, and she wanted to have enough split before the day's work began. As she reached for a large piece, her hand slipped. A jagged edge caught her palm, leaving an angry red gash. She bit back a cry, but Tocho heard anyway. He appeared in the doorway, took one look at her bleeding hand, and gestured for her to come inside. Clara followed, cradling her injured palm against her chest. Tocho pulled his chair close to the hearth, motioning for her to sit. He gathered clean cloth, water, and a small clay pot of salve. With gentle hands that seemed too large for such delicate work, he cleaned the cut. His touch was careful, almost reverent, as he spread the medicine and began wrapping her palm. "My mother," he said softly, surprising Clara with the break in silence. She knew songs for healing. His eyes stayed focused on his work, but his voice carried warmth. "When I was small and hurt, she would sing them over me." Clara sat very still, knowing how rare it was for him to speak of his past. As he secured the bandage, Tocho began to hum, then sing, his deep voice barely above a whisper. The Apache words flowed like water over stones, and though Clara couldn't understand them, she felt their power. The pain in her hand seemed to ease as he finished tying the cloth. Several days later, they heard hoofbeats approaching. It was Jimmy Wells, the mail rider, his horse lathered from hard riding. He pulled up short at their gate. "Mrs. Boone sent me," he called out, still catching his breath. "Her grandson Micah's taken bad sick with fever. Been asking for help all over town." Clara stepped forward. "What about Doctor?" "Callahan?" Jimmy shook his head. "Says it's just a cough, nothing worth his time, but the boy's burning up something fierce." Clara turned to Tocho, who was already moving toward his herb shelf. They gathered willow bark for the fever and yarrow for the cough, packing them quickly into Tocho's saddlebags. Within minutes, they were mounted and following Jimmy into town. They found Sarah Boone's small house on the edge of town, near the church where her late husband had preached. She met them at the door, her usually calm face drawn with worry. "They've put him in the shed," she said quietly. "Neighbors won't let him in their homes, afraid of catching something." The shed was cold and dark. Micah lay on a makeshift bed of hay, his small face flushed with fever. Clara knelt beside him while Tocho built a small fire in the old stove. "Just a cough," Clara muttered, feeling the boy's burning forehead. She looked at Mrs. Boone. "How long has he been like this?" 3 days. Dr. Callahan wouldn't even look at him properly. The older woman's voice held rare bitterness. Said some children just weren't meant to survive the frontier. Clara and Tocho worked through the night. She made willow bark tea while he kept the fire steady. They took turns bathing Micah's face with cool cloths, giving him sips of medicine whenever he was conscious enough to swallow. Around midnight, the boy began coughing deeply, each breath a struggle. Tocho moved closer, lifting Micah to sit up against his chest. Then, just as he had done for Clara's hand, he began to sing. The healing song filled the small space, and gradually, Micah's breathing eased. He settled into exhausted sleep, his head resting trustingly against Tocho's shoulder. Mrs. Boone watched them from her chair by the stove, her eyes bright with tears. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she whispered, reaching out to squeeze Clara's unwounded hand. As dawn approached, Micah's fever finally broke. Color returned to his cheeks, and his breathing grew deep and regular. Clara sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of how tired she was. She looked up to find Tocho watching her, his dark eyes full of something that made her heart skip. He nodded once, a gesture that contained pride, respect, and something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. Together they had done what the town's most educated man would not, seen the worth in a child others had dismissed and fought through the night to prove it. The morning after Micah's fever broke, Clara and Tocho stood quietly behind Mrs. Boone outside McNabb's Mercantile. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the dusty street as townspeople moved about their morning business. Some paused to stare at the unusual trio. Mrs. Boone drew herself up to her full height, her gray hair neat beneath her bonnet. Though she wasn't tall, her presence commanded attention, the authority of 20 years as the pastor's wife evident in her bearing. "Friends," she called out, her clear voice carrying across the street. Several people stopped, turning to listen. Mr. McNabb himself appeared in the doorway of his store, wiping his hands on his apron. "I want to speak about what happened last night," Mrs. Boone continued. "My grandson Micah was desperately ill with fever. When others turned away—" Here she paused, her gaze sweeping across those gathered. "These two good people came to help." Clara felt her cheeks warm as more townspeople drifted closer. She fought the urge to shrink behind Tocho's tall frame. They stayed through the night, tending him with knowledge and gentleness. "This morning, my grandson sits up in bed, asking for breakfast." Mrs. Boone's voice grew thick with emotion. "I believe they were a blessing sent by Providence itself." A murmur went through the small crowd. Clara saw Mrs. Miller, who'd lost 2 children to fever last winter, nodding slowly. Old Pete Thompson, who'd fought in the Indian Wars but now spent his days whittling on his porch, studied Tocho with thoughtful eyes. "The Lord works through unexpected vessels," Mrs. Boone finished firmly, "and I thank him for sending these 2 to us." Some of the gathered townspeople nodded in agreement. Clara noticed Mr. McNabb's wife dabbing at her eyes with her handkerchief, but others turned away, their faces hard with disapproval. Dr. Callahan, watching from his office porch across the street, spat into the dust and went inside. The crowd began to disperse, but Mrs. Boone's words stayed with Clara. That evening, as she stirred a pot of apple butter, an idea took root. The town's annual Harvest Sunday was approaching, a tradition of sharing food and giving thanks. In previous years, she'd stayed home, avoiding the sidelong glances and whispered comments. "I want to make jams for the harvest gathering," she told Tocho over supper, "to share with everyone." He considered her words while finishing his stew. "You wish to go among them?" Clara nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "Mrs. Boone showed me that maybe there's a place for us after all." The next day, Tocho disappeared into his workshop. The sound of sawing and sanding filled the air. By evening, he'd created 3 sturdy wooden crates, perfectly sized for holding mason jars. He'd carved simple patterns of leaves along the sides, beautiful but practical, like everything he made. Clara spent the next week preparing her preserves. Apple butter rich with cinnamon, wild plum jam glowing like garnets, pear preserves golden as sunset. Each jar was carefully sealed and labeled in her neat handwriting. The evening before Harvest Sunday, they sat outside the cabin. The stars spread across the sky like scattered sugar. and a coyote called in the distance. Clara pulled her shawl tighter against the cooling air. "I never thought," she said softly, "that any man would see me without flinching." The admission felt both frightening and freeing. Tocho was quiet for a long moment. His profile was strong against the starlit sky as he considered his words. "You carry peace in your hands," he finally said. "I saw it first when you held the tongs at my forge. I see it when you tend the trees, prepare food, help the sick." He turned to look at her directly. "There is nothing to flinch from." Clara's heart swelled with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. They sat in companionable silence until the moon rose. The next morning dawned clear and cool. They loaded the crates carefully into Tocho's wagon, each jar nestled in straw. Clara smoothed her best dress, altered now to fit her properly, and climbed up beside Tocho on the wagon seat. As they drove toward town, Clara watched the familiar landscape roll past. The red stones caught the morning light, and a hawk circled overhead. She didn't know what welcome they'd find in Three Wells, but she felt stronger than she had in years. The wagon wheels left tracks in the dusty road, marking their path forward together. The morning of Harvest Sunday dawned bright and clear. Colorful banners fluttered from the church steeple and between buildings, their cheerful colors catching the autumn breeze. The town square buzzed with activity as farmers' wives arranged pies on hay carts, their crusts golden and still warm from morning baking. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she and Tocho unloaded their wooden crates. Her collection of preserves gleamed in the sunlight. Dozens of jars filled with every shade of amber, ruby, and gold. Tocho worked quietly beside her, his presence steady and reassuring as they arranged the display on their assigned table. Mrs. Boone approached, her face brightening at the sight. "My word, Clara. These are beautiful." She lifted a jar of plum preserves, holding it to the light. "Such perfect clarity. And look at these labels. Neat as printing." More townspeople gathered, drawn by Mrs. Boone's enthusiasm. Clara found herself explaining her methods, surprised by the genuine interest in her voice. "The secret is timing," she said, gaining confidence. "You have to catch the fruit at just the right moment." As the judging began, Clara felt Tocho move closer, his arm coming to rest lightly at her back. The touch was gentle but protective, and she drew strength from it. The judges, 3 gray-haired ladies from neighboring towns, moved from table to table, tasting and discussing in low voices. Children darted between the displays, some stopping to stare at Tocho's impressive height and Clara's sturdy frame. A few pointed and whispered, but others smiled, shyly, especially little Micah Boone, who waved from behind his grandmother's skirts. When the judges reached their table, Clara held her breath. They sampled her wild plum jam, then the apple butter, and finally the pear preserves. Their eyebrows rose in appreciation, and they huddled together, whispering intently. From the church steps, Dr. Callahan watched the scene unfold, his jaw clenched tight. His fingers drummed against his leg as the judges moved toward the front of the gathering. "First prize for preserves," announced the head judge, her voice carrying across the square, "goes to Clara Wheaton for an outstanding collection, showing both skill and creativity." A ripple of applause spread through the crowd. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as Mrs. Boone pressed the blue ribbon into her hands. Tocho's arm tightened slightly at her back, and when she glanced up at him, she caught the ghost of a smile in his eyes. The rest of the fair passed in a blur of congratulations and requests for recipes. Clara noticed how some townspeople now approached them both, asking Tocho about his forge work while praising her preserves. Others still kept their distance, clustering in small groups and whispering behind their hands. As the sun began to set and people packed up their displays, Clara saw Dr. Callahan deep in conversation with several town council members. Their faces were serious, and they kept glancing in her direction. Something cold settled in her stomach, but she lifted her chin and continued helping Tocho load their empty crates. The next morning dawned gray and cool. Clara was hanging wash when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Sheriff Monroe rode up to the cabin, his face set in official lines. He dismounted stiffly, pushing his hat back as he approached. "Miss Wheaton," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Got some questions need asking." Clara wiped her hands on her apron, standing straight. "What kind of questions, Sheriff?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Counsel's concerned about proper behavior. Need to know if you're—" He cleared his throat. "Living in sin with an Indian?" Heat rushed to Clara's face, not from shame but from anger. She thought of Tocho's quiet strength, his gentle hands, the way he'd given her a room of her own and never presumed. She thought of his morning prayers, the respect he showed to every living thing, the way he'd helped save Micah without hesitation. "He's more Christian than you'll ever be," she said proudly, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. The sheriff's face reddened. "Now see here." "No, you see here," Clara continued, surprising herself with her boldness. "Tocho prays every morning. He helps those in need. He judges no one. Can you say the same?" Behind her, she heard the steady rhythm of Tocho's hammer, pause, then resume. The sound gave her courage. Sheriff Monroe fingered his badge uncertainly. Councils received complaints about propriety and such. Dr. Callahan's mighty concerned about the example being set. "Dr. Callahan," Clara said evenly, "refused to help a sick child. We didn't. Which seems more proper to you?" The sheriff had no answer for that. He mounted his horse awkwardly, settling his hat back on his head. "You've been warned," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Counsel won't stand for impropriety." Clara watched him ride away, her heart pounding but her spine straight. When his horse disappeared around the bend, she heard Tocho's footsteps behind her. "You spoke well," he said quietly. Clara turned to face him, finding strength in his steady gaze. "I spoke truth," she replied. The moon hung low over the orchard when the sound of stumbling hoofbeats broke the evening quiet. Clara looked up from her mending, catching Tocho's eye across the hearth. A horse whinnied outside, followed by heavy footsteps on the porch. 3 uneven knocks rattled the door. Clara rose slowly, her heart racing as she recognized the familiar pattern, her father's knock from childhood. She opened the door to find Silas Wheaton swaying slightly, his eyes red-rimmed and glassy from drink. "Clara," he mumbled, his voice thick with emotion. I had to come." She stepped back, allowing him to stumble inside. The lamplight caught the silver in his hair, making him look older than she remembered. Tocho moved silently to stand near the hearth, watching but not interfering. Silas sank into a chair, his weathered hands trembling as he removed his hat. The smell of whiskey clung to his clothes, but his eyes were clear with shame as he looked at his daughter. "I gave you away 'cause I was scared," he confessed, tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. "Scared of failing the ranch, scared of what folks would say, scared of seeing your mama's eyes every time I looked at you." He drew a shaky breath. "But you found something better than I ever gave you." Clara stood frozen, years of hurt warring with the raw honesty in her father's voice. Tocho stepped forward then, his movement drawing Silas's attention. The old rancher looked up at the tall Apache, something like respect mixing with his remorse. Silas extended a rough, calloused hand toward Tocho. "Thank you," he whispered, "for seeing what I was too blind to see." Tocho accepted the handshake with quiet dignity. Without a word, he moved to the stove and prepared tea for all 3 of them. They sat in silence as the night deepened, steam rising from their cups, the only sound the occasional pop of the hearth fire. When the eastern sky began to lighten, Silas rose stiffly from his chair. His eyes were clearer now, his shoulders straighter despite the weight of his confession. At the door, he turned to Clara. "I'll speak for you if it comes to that," he promised solemnly. "Won't let them hurt you again, either of you." Clara watched from the porch as her father mounted his horse and rode slowly away, his figure growing smaller against the dawn sky. Her heart felt both heavy and light. Old wounds, still tender, but touched now by the first breath of healing. Tocho's steady presence beside her anchored her in this moment of fragile grace. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear as Clara hung laundry in the orchard. The clip-clop of approaching horses made her pause, a damp sheet still in her hands. 3 riders appeared through the trees, Sheriff Monroe and 2 deputies she didn't recognize. Her stomach knotted as they dismounted. The sheriff's face was grim beneath his hat brim. "Where's Tocho?" he demanded, not meeting her eyes. "At the forge," Clara answered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The rhythmic clang of hammer on metal confirmed her words. The men strode past her, hands resting on their gun belts. Clara dropped the sheet and hurried after them, bare feet silent on the packed earth. As they approached the forge, Tocho looked up from his work. His expression remained calm, though his shoulders tensed at the sight of armed men. "You're under arrest," Sheriff Monroe announced, "for the abduction of a white woman." "What?" Clara burst out. "That's ridiculous. He didn't abduct me. My father gave me—" "Step back, miss," one deputy warned, moving to block her path. Tocho set down his hammer with deliberate care. His eyes met Clara's for a moment, deep with unspoken meaning. Then he turned to face the lawmen, head held high. "You'll come peaceful-like?" the sheriff asked, though his hand still hovered near his pistol. Tocho gave a single nod. The deputies moved forward with iron shackles that glinted dully in the forge light. "No!" Clara tried to push past them. "This is wrong. He's done nothing." The second deputy caught her arm, holding her back as they chained Tocho's wrists. "Don't make this worse, miss," Sheriff Monroe muttered. "Law's the law." Clara watched helplessly as they led Tocho to their horses. His back was straight, his steps measured, dignity in every line of his body. Not once did he bow his head or show fear. As soon as the riders disappeared down the trail, Clara ran inside. Her hands shook as she hitched up the wagon. She had to find help, had to fight this injustice. Mrs. Boone would know what to do. The old widow was hanging herbs to dry when Clara arrived, breathless and tearful. One look at Clara's face told her something was terribly wrong. "They took him!" Clara gasped. "The sheriff, they arrested Tocho on false charges." Mrs. Boone's wise eyes narrowed. "Come inside, child. Tell me everything." Over cups of chamomile tea, Clara poured out the morning's events. Mrs. Boone listened intently, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "There are good people in this town," she said finally. "People who saw how you both cared for my grandson Micah. We'll find those willing to speak truth." Together they visited select homes, the cooper whose daughter Tocho had helped after a fall, the widow Martinez who traded vegetables for his metalwork, the former cavalry sergeant who remembered Tocho's service. By sunset, 5 townspeople had agreed to testify about Tocho's character and Clara's obvious freedom. Back at the homestead, Clara searched Tocho's few possessions with trembling fingers. In a leather pouch, she found his carefully preserved Army discharge papers, marked with commendations for bravery and loyalty. Beneath them lay something else, an unfinished letter to the territorial governor describing the broken treaties and injustices faced by his people. The words were carefully chosen, revealing both his education and his heart for justice. As night fell, Clara knelt beside her bed. The familiar quiet of the cabin felt empty without Tocho's presence. She clasped her hands tightly, tears falling onto the rough blanket. "Lord," she whispered, "give me strength to stand for what's right. Help me fight for the man who saw worth in me when no one else did. Whatever comes tomorrow, let truth prevail." The moonlight filtered through her window, touching the mesquite bench Tocho had carved for her. The Apache word for beloved seemed to glow in the silver light. Clara traced the letters with her finger, drawing courage from their meaning. She gathered the papers, proof of Tocho's honor and character, and placed them carefully in her father's old satchel. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight she armed herself with evidence and allies, preparing to defend the man who had defended her own dignity so well. The autumn morning shattered with. The church bells of Three Wells rang clear across the dusty streets that Sunday morning. Clara stood at the back of the white-painted building, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her father's worn leather satchel. The familiar scents of pine wood and lamp oil filled the air as townsfolk filed in, their Sunday best rustling against the wooden pews. Through the open doors she could see Dr. Callahan seated prominently near the front, his silver watch chain gleaming. Her father Silas sat quietly in the back row, hat in his lap, looking older than she remembered. Mrs. Boone caught her eye from the middle pews and gave an encouraging nod. When Reverend Matthews finished his sermon about mercy, Clara took a deep breath and walked forward. Her boots echoed on the wooden floor as conversations hushed to whispers, then silence. Standing before the pulpit, she opened the satchel with steady fingers. "I stand here today," she began, her voice clear despite her racing heart, "to speak truth before God and this congregation." The papers rustled as she withdrew them, sunlight from the high windows catching the official seals. "This is a letter written by Tocho, who sits in jail on false charges." She held up the carefully penned pages. "Many of you know him only as the Apache blacksmith who lives beyond town. But these Army papers show he served honorably as a U.S. cavalry scout, helping protect the very settlers who now turn their backs on him." Murmurs rippled through the church. Clara's voice grew stronger as she read Tocho's words, describing the treaties that guaranteed his right to the land, the promises made and broken, the dignity with which he chose to live despite betrayal. "He holds legal title to his homestead," Clara continued, "yet this town refuses to honor its word. Why? Because some here—" Her eyes found Dr. Callahan's rigid form, "would rather spread lies than face their own prejudice." The doctor's face darkened, but Clara pressed on. "Doctor, Callahan claims Tocho abducted me. That's false. My father—" her voice caught for a moment as she looked at Silas— "arranged for me to go with Tocho. And what I found there wasn't captivity. I found respect, understanding, a man who saw worth in me when others saw only shame." The congregation sat stone still. Clara's heart pounded, but she lifted her chin and spoke the words she'd carried silently for months. "This man is my husband in every way but name, and I love him." Gasps echoed off the church walls. Women covered their mouths with gloved hands. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Dr. Callahan half rose, his face mottled with anger. But before he could speak, another voice rang out, "So, do I believe in that man?" Mrs. Boone stood, her gray head held high. "I watched him and Clara tend my grandson Micah when others wouldn't. That's Christian charity indeed, not just word." A moment of heavy silence followed. Then the cooper, Mr. Jenkins, cleared his throat and stood. "Tocho fixed my wagon wheel last spring. Wouldn't take payment when he knew times were hard." He nodded firmly. "He's a good man." Another rose, the widow Martinez. "He brings me firewood before winter, never asks nothing in return." One by one, others joined them. The former cavalry sergeant spoke of Tocho's service. A farmer told how Tocho had helped find his lost child. Each voice added to a chorus of truth that could no longer be denied. Clara watched as faces changed, as understanding dawned in eyes that had been clouded by fear and prejudice. Her father Silas stood slowly, his voice rough with emotion. "My daughter speaks truth," he declared. "I was wrong to treat her, and him, as I did. But they showed me what real dignity looks like." He turned to face the congregation. "If we claim to follow Christ's teaching, we cannot deny justice to this man." The church fell silent again, but it was a different kind of quiet, thoughtful, pregnant with possibility. Clara folded Tocho's letter carefully, her heart full of hope and gratitude for each person who had found the courage to stand. Through the church windows, the autumn sun painted squares of golden light across the wooden floor. In that moment, Clara felt the presence of something larger than herself, the power of truth spoken in love, of community choosing justice over fear, of hearts opening to change. The autumn wind rattled the jail's barred windows as Sheriff Monroe paced behind his desk, fingers drumming against his gun belt. Clara stood firm, Mrs. Boone and several townsfolk behind her, while Silas held the stack of papers proving Tocho's legal rights. "Now see here," the sheriff said, his voice gruff with uncertainty. "Can't just release a prisoner without proper—" "Without proper what, Walt?" Mrs. Boone interrupted, her gray eyes sharp. "Without proper cause for arrest in the first place? These good people just testified to his character in church." The sheriff's weathered face tightened. "Dr. Callahan made serious accusations." "False accusations," Clara said quietly but firmly. "And you know it. These papers prove Tocho's land rights and his service record. How do you think the territorial governor would react to learning one of his decorated scouts was jailed on lies?" Silas stepped forward, boots scraping on the wooden floor. "Walt, you've known me 30 years. I'm telling you now, this man has done nothing wrong, and if you keep him here, we'll take this all the way to Santa Fe." Sheriff Monroe's gaze swept across the determined faces before him. Mr. Jenkins, the cooper, nodded gravely. The widow Martinez clutched her rosary. Even old Sergeant Mackenzie stood straight-backed by the door, his cavalry medals glinting. "I reckon," the sheriff said slowly, "that holding a man without proper cause might cause more trouble than it's worth." He reached for his keys with deliberate movements. "But I'm noting this all down in the official record." The cell door's hinges creaked as it opened. Tocho sat on the narrow cot, his broad shoulders straight despite 3 days of confinement. His dark eyes found Clara's immediately. "You came," he said simply, rising to his feet. Clara didn't hesitate. She crossed the cell in 3 steps and threw her arms around him, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and forge smoke that even jail couldn't erase. His strong arms encircled her carefully, protectively, as if she were made of precious glass. "Of course I came," she whispered against his chest. "I'll always come for you." Someone cleared their throat, Silas, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "Well then," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "suppose you both might want to come to supper. Sarah's making her chicken and dumplings." Clara pulled back slightly, looking up at Tocho's face. He studied Silas for a long moment, then nodded once, gravely. "We would be honored." The walk to the Wheaton Ranch house was quiet, dust kicking up beneath their boots as the setting sun painted the hills gold. Clara's hand found Tocho's, their fingers intertwining naturally, comfortably. Behind them, Silas led his horse, the saddle creaking rhythmically. The old kitchen smelled of fresh bread and simmering stew when they arrived. Sarah, their housekeeper, who'd helped raise Clara after her mother died, wiped her hands on her apron and gave Tocho a warm smile. "Welcome home, Miss Clara," she said, then turned to Tocho. "And welcome to you, sir. The biscuits are just about ready." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she looked around the familiar space, the worn wooden table where she'd done her schoolwork, the cast-iron stove that had warmed countless winter mornings, the window where her mother used to watch for spring birds. But now, with Tocho's solid presence beside her, the memories felt different, less painful, more like a bridge between past and future. Silas pulled out chairs for them both, then sat heavily at his usual place. "Sarah outdid herself tonight," he said, passing the butter. "Though I hear tell you've become quite the cook yourself, Clara." "She makes the best apple preserves I've ever tasted," Tocho said quietly, his deep voice carrying warmth that made Clara blush. The conversation flowed easier than Clara would have expected, like a stream finding its natural course. Silas asked about Tocho's forge work. Sarah wanted to know about Clara's herb garden. Tocho shared stories of his mother's cooking, making them all laugh with tales of his early attempts at baking bread. As Clara watched her father and Tocho discuss rainfall patterns and cattle breeds, she felt something shift and settle in her heart. Here, in this kitchen where she'd once felt so out of place, she finally felt at home. Not because the space had changed, but because she had. Because love had given her the strength to become fully herself. The lamplight gleamed warm on the familiar walls, and when Tocho's hand found hers under the table, Clara squeezed it gently. They had faced down prejudice with truth, answered hatred with dignity, and found family in the most unexpected places. Together they had built something stronger than fear, a love as solid as the mesa stones, as enduring as the ancient stars above their home. The first frost came early that year, painting the mesa grass silver in the dawn light. Clara stood at the cabin door, wrapping her shawl tighter as she watched Tocho measure timber for their new addition. The sound of his saw cutting through wood echoed across the clearing, steady and sure. "We'll need more nails," he said, looking up from his work. His breath made clouds in the crisp morning air. "And perhaps another window for light." Clara nodded, already picturing the expanded space, room enough for storage, for visitors, for dreams neither of them had dared voice yet. "Mrs. Boone is coming by later. She has ideas for the community pantry." As if summoned by her name, Mrs. Boone's wagon appeared on the winding path, her gray mare picking her way carefully through the morning frost. The older woman's face was bright with excitement as she climbed down, clutching a roll of papers. "I've drawn up some plans," she announced, spreading them on Tocho's workbench. "See here, shelves along this wall for Clara's preserves, space for dried goods, and hooks for hanging herbs, a place where anyone in need can come." Tocho studied the drawings thoughtfully. "The beams will need to be strong. Winter storms up here can be fierce." "That's why we trust your work," Mrs. Boone said simply. She turned to Clara. "And speaking of trust, 3 more families asked about your jam-making lessons." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest, despite the cold. Just last week, she'd taught 5 young girls how to properly seal preserved jars. Their eager faces and quick questions had reminded her of herself at that age, before shame had taught her to be silent. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 2 settlers from the valley, brothers who'd never spoken to Tocho before, rode up leading limping horses. "Heard tell you're the best blacksmith in 3 counties," the older one said, hat in hand. "Our horses need new shoes, and winter's coming fast." Tocho nodded, already moving toward his forge. "It will take time. You're welcome to wait by the fire." Clara brought them coffee while Tocho worked, listening as they awkwardly, then more easily, shared stories of their own struggles homesteading. By the time the horses were reshod, something had shifted in their eyes when they looked at Tocho, respect replacing wariness. The afternoon brought more visitors, young girls for Clara's promised jam-making lesson. They gathered around her kitchen table, faces intent as she demonstrated how to test for proper setting. "Miss Clara?" the youngest one asked, stirring carefully. "Is it true what they say, that your pa gave you away?" The other girls fell silent, but Clara didn't flinch. Through the window she could see Tocho at his forge, his steady movements a dance she'd come to love. Mrs. Boone was hanging herbs to dry, humming an old hymn. The new addition's framework rose strong against the autumn sky. "No, child," Clara said, smiling as she helped the girl adjust her stirring technique. "I wasn't given away, I was found by someone who saw me truly, and by a community that learned to see with new eyes." She lifted the spoon, watching the jam drip. "Perfect consistency. You have a natural gift for this." The girl beamed, and Clara saw in her face the same joy she now felt every morning, the joy of being valued, of belonging. Later, as the sun set and their visitors departed, Clara and Tocho stood together looking at their day's work. The new addition's bones reached toward the darkening sky, solid and full of promise. Inside, rows of jars gleamed like jewels, ready for the community pantry's shelves. "You're good with them," Tocho said quietly. "The children, they see your strength." Clara leaned against him, feeling the warmth of his body against the evening chill. "They see what you saw first," she replied. "That worth isn't measured by others' fears." The wind carried the scent of pine and coming snow, but their clearing felt like a warm haven. Here, where prejudice had been answered with patience, where rejection had been transformed into welcome, something new was growing, not just walls and shelves, but healing itself, spreading outward like ripples in still water. The old mission arch had stood broken for decades, its adobe walls crumbling like forgotten promises. But on a bright winter morning, wagons rolled up the winding path to Tocho's homestead, loaded with fresh mixed mortar and scaffolding. Mrs. Boone organized the volunteers while Silas directed the repair work, his weathered hands pointing out where support beams needed strengthening. Tocho worked alongside the men, showing them how to properly cure the adobe bricks. Clara kept the workers fed with hot coffee and fresh bread, watching with quiet joy as the arch slowly regained its dignity. Even the new doctor, Sarah Martinez, came to help, her knowledge of traditional building methods learned from her Navajo teacher proving invaluable. The bell arrived by freight wagon in February, a gift from the town council, their way of making amends. It took 6 men to hoist it into place, its bronze surface catching the late winter sun. When they rang it for the first time, the clear tone echoed across the mesa, calling people home. March brought winds that swept winter's last breath from the hills. Clara stood before her mirror on her wedding morning, smoothing the blue dress she'd sewn by lamplight through the cold months. The fabric had come from Mrs. Boone's trunk. "Something borrowed, something blue," the older woman had said with a wink. "You look like your mama," Silas said from the doorway, his voice rough with emotion. He'd arrived early, wearing his good suit, a new string tie knotted at his throat. "She'd be proud of you, Clara, proud of who you've become." Clara touched the simple silver bracelet at her wrist, Tocho's gift, shaped by his own hands. "I never thought I'd have this," she whispered. "A real wedding? With people who—" She trailed off, overcome. "With people who love you," Silas finished, offering his arm. "It's time." They walked together toward the restored mission arch, where townsfolk had gathered in their Sunday best. Children scattered flower petals along the path, wild primrose and early spring violets. The new bell rang out 3 times, clear and sweet in the morning air. Tocho waited beneath the arch, tall and dignified in his best white shirt and dark vest. His long hair was tied back with a beaded leather band, and his eyes never left Clara as she approached. Mrs. Boone had arranged cedar boughs and early apple blossoms around the arch, their fragrance mixing with the sage that burned in a small clay bowl, honoring both their traditions. The ceremony was simple but sacred. The minister spoke of love's power to bridge all divisions, while a tribal elder blessed them in Apache, the ancient words carrying wisdom across generations. When Tocho took Clara's hands in his, they were steady and warm. Their I-do's rang out clear as the bell above them. "What God and these witnesses have joined," the minister proclaimed, "let no one tear asunder." The celebration spread beneath the bare apple trees, where tables groaned with food brought by every family. Steam rose from pots of rich venison stew, and Clara's apple cake, made from last fall's harvest, held the place of honor. Children played between the trees, while adults gathered in clusters, sharing stories and laughter. Dr. Martinez sat with some of the tribal elders, discussing healing plants and birthing traditions. She'd brought a shift of fresh thinking to 3 Wells after Dr. Callahan's bitter departure months ago. Her presence, like the restored mission arch, represented the town's slow but steady change. "Remember when you first came here?" Mrs. Boone asked Clara as they watched Tocho showing some young boys how to properly split kindling. "Look how far we've all come." Clara smiled, touching her wedding ring, a simple band Tocho had forged himself. "The land knew better than we did," she said softly. "It brought us all together." The celebration continued until sunset painted the mission arch in gold. As people began their journeys home, many stopped to hug Clara or clasp Tocho's hand. Each farewell felt like a blessing, each smile a promise of continued support. The new bell rang once more as the last wagon disappeared down the trail, its tone carrying across the mesa like a prayer. Clara and Tocho stood together beneath the arch, watching the colors fade from the sky. Their union, once born of desperation and shame, had blossomed into something beautiful, not just for them, but for an entire community. "Welcome home," Tocho said quietly, and Clara knew he meant more than just their cabin, more than just this land. He meant the home they'd built in each other's hearts, the home they'd helped build in their town's conscience, the home that would stand as strong as the restored mission arch above them. Spring painted the mesa in delicate brushstrokes of green and gold. Wild primrose dotted the hillsides, and the apple trees in Tocho's orchard burst with pink-white blossoms that drifted like snow in the gentle breeze. The restored mission stood proud against the azure sky, its fresh adobe walls gleaming in the morning light. At the mission gate, townspeople gathered for the mounting of a new brass plaque. Mrs. Boone had commissioned it from Tocho's forge, and he'd worked countless hours to make it perfect. The words caught the sunlight. To those whom the world cast aside, here they were chosen. Clara stood back, watching as Tocho carefully secured the plaque to the stone pillar. Her heart swelled at the sight of his large hands moving with such precision, the same gentle strength she'd come to know so well. Several children crowded around, asking questions about how the metal was shaped and polished. Later that afternoon, Clara sat beneath the flowering apple trees, surrounded by a half-dozen children from town. She held up a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe, her finger tracking the words as young voices stumbled through the sentences. When little Sarah Miller successfully read a difficult passage, Clara beamed with pride. "Miss Clara," Tommy Boone asked, looking up from his primer, "how come you teach us out here instead of in town?" Clara smiled, touching a fallen blossom. "Because learning grows best in beautiful places," she said softly, "just like these apple trees." From the mission roof, the rhythmic sound of Tocho's hammer rang out. He was mounting the cross he'd spent weeks forging, an intricate piece that combined both Apache and Christian symbols in its design. The children would pause in their reading sometimes, watching in wonder as he balanced on the beams, his movements sure and steady. As evening approached, Clara settled into her favorite chair on the porch, the one Tocho had made specially for her. The sunset painted the western sky in deep purples and golds, while the first stars began to twinkle overhead. Tocho joined her, his work-worn hand finding hers naturally, their fingers intertwining. The evening air carried the sweet scent of apple blossoms and sage. From somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the new mission bell chimed softly in the evening breeze. "You still think you were given?" Tocho asked quietly, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. Clara leaned over, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "No," she said, her voice full of peace and certainty. "I was led." If something in this story whispered to your spirit, stay a while. Subscribe and come back tomorrow. The next story may be the one you didn't know you needed.